measure our success not only by the battles we win, but also by the wars we end.
The U.S. will take over the Gaza Strip. We'll own it. Know that China is doing very poorly right now. I just saw some reports coming out, and I don't want that to happen to China.
You're gambling with World War III.
I was saved by God to make America great again.
I'm Roland Oliphant, and this is Battle Lines. It's Monday, the 11th of August, 2025. Today, American hawks are demanding Australia do more for Pacific security. But a former Australian Defence Minister explains why for Canberra, war with China is not a parlour game. But first, yesterday, the Israeli military killed the Al Jazeera journalist Anas al-Sharif and 4 other reporters in a targeted assassination in Gaza. Israel says he was a terrorist. Others, including al-Sharif himself, who predicted his assassination before he died, say he was killed for his journalism. The Committee to Protect Journalists counts 186 reporters who've been confirmed killed in Gaza since October 7th. This killing has caused a particular resonance, partly because al-Sharif was so prominent, but also because instead of denying the killing or saying it was an accident, Israel is admitting to deliberately targeting him. Earlier, I spoke to Henry Bodkin, the Telegraph's man in Jerusalem, about what happened and what it means for the future of journalism in the conflict. I started by asking him to talk me through the exact circumstances of al-Sharif's death.
We know that he was killed in a tent outside Al-Shifa Hospital, which is in Gaza City, the northern conurbation in Gaza, which is currently not under Israeli control. We're told that there were 4 other Al Jazeera journalists in the tent or at the site of the strike who were killed, plus an assistant. A freelance journalist was reportedly also taken out in the strike, and there were reports of 2 other casualties as well. Shortly before midnight, they said a short while ago, the IDF struck the terrorist Anas al-Sharif, who posed as a journalist for the Al Jazeera network. That's a quote from the IDF press office. So the strike took place reasonably late last night.
Really late last night, that's Sunday night for listeners who are listening to this after Monday. There's the facts. You've quoted the IDF justification for this. They're saying he was a terrorist. That's strongly disputed, as we'll get into. But there's a great deal of resonance here, and I think for several reasons. One reason is that Israel isn't saying this was collateral damage. They're saying they deliberately targeted this news team. I think one of the other things is that a large number of journalists have been killed during the course of this war in Gaza already, so it refocuses attention on those incidents. And I suppose, lastly, it raises all kinds of questions about the difficulties of covering this war, about press access, and of course about the morality and truth, and the dangers around the targeting of journalists more generally. That's a lot, and we haven't got much time, but maybe you could start by telling us, why don't we start with who was Anas al-Sharif?
He was a reporter in his 20s. He was an Al Jazeera reporter, although he'd previously been part of a team, a Reuters team, which won a Pulitzer Prize last year. So he's been very prominent in covering the war in Gaza in the last couple of years. Last October, the IDF accused him and a small handful of other journalists working in Gaza of being Hamas terrorists. And they released some documents which they say proved that. Now, I'm looking at them at the moment. So they purport to be, in the case of al-Sharif, that his name appears on a Hamas document of operatives in the northern Gaza Strip brigade, I'm quoting there. And then we've got a phone directory of the East Jabalia battalion in Hamas. His name appears on there, his phone number, and other documents as well. Now, it's impossible. This is not conclusive evidence. Anyone could have come up with that on an Excel spreadsheet. In fairness to the IDF, perhaps Hamas use Excel spreadsheets on laptops. There's no reason why they wouldn't. But in the form that it's presented online, and anyone can search for it, it's on the internet. You can't tell who wrote it and where it came from, right? So they accused him in October last year. Al Jazeera have always flatly denied this. They say that Israel is trying to silence one of the most active voices, highlighting the humanitarian cost of the war. I suppose the next really important incident to go back to is only a month ago, or less than a month ago, actually, late July, the last week of July, when al-Sharif did a very emotive report on the hunger situation in Gaza. He broke down in tears. It was a pretty harrowing piece of television. The Israelis were incensed about this, and they accused him of crocodile tears, quote unquote, and they repeated their charge that he was a terrorist. And that's when various international bodies, the Committee to Protect Journalists, for example, said, look, we're really worried about him now. The Israelis keep calling him a terrorist, and we think they're going to take him out. And last night they did.
Yeah, I've got that statement in front of me right here. 24th of July 2025, just a couple of weeks ago, the Committee to Protect Journalists is gravely worried about the safety of Al Jazeera Arabic's Gaza correspondent Anas al-Sharif, who is being targeted by an Israeli smear campaign, which he believes is a precursor to his assassination. One obvious question is there any truth to those Israeli claims about him? If so, would it justify his killing? Or is there any reason for us to believe that the Israelis targeted him not because he was purportedly a member of Hamas, but because of his journalism, which is certainly what a lot of his supporters, what the Committee to Protect Journalists, for example, seem to believe?
So the Israelis say that he was led a cell of active Hamas terrorists that fired rockets. As I said, the evidence they've put forward, you cannot say that proves that. So we don't know whether he was an active militant. Listeners to the podcast may have logged on to Al Jazeera in the past. Now, almost certainly that would have been Al Jazeera English, which actually is quite palatable to the West. It's not too dissimilar from major international news organizations, CNN, dare I say, even the BBC. It gives quite a good stab at being a balanced and thorough journalistic organization. Al Jazeera Arabic is quite different. I've been speaking to quite a lot of Palestinians, particularly people who understand the media side of things in the Arab world this morning. And Al Jazeera Arabic is seen as a bit of a mouthpiece for Hamas. There's never any criticism of Hamas on it. Live broadcasts where people have criticized Hamas, or importantly, Qatar, which oversees Al Jazeera Arabic and is known to be kind of slightly friendly to the Muslim Brotherhood principles upon which Hamas is based. That those people have been cut off. Hamas statements often come out first through Al Jazeera Arabic, and they get very, very good access around Gaza. That's the context. It's been suggested to me that, look, you can't operate as Anas al-Sharif did without at least Hamas thinking he's all right. We'll let him in here. We'll let him in there, because that's the nature of the reality on the ground in Gaza. Now, none of that means that he was necessarily a active militant. He did seem to spend a lot of his time on telly, so it does raise the question of when he would have had time to be firing these rockets. And I suppose it raises the question, does being an unbalanced journalist, if we accept the argument for the time being that Al Jazeera Arabic is not a particularly balanced news source, and it's important to remember that not just the Israelis hate them, but the Palestinians in the West Bank, the Palestinian Authority, hate them. They chuck them out as well. Much of the Arab world absolutely hate them because they do not like the Muslim Brotherhood. But is being a slightly unbalanced journalist, if that is indeed what he was, does that mean you deserve to die? That's what Palestinians are asking this morning, people who don't necessarily like Al Jazeera Arabic. And that's the question, and the other question that the Israelis have to answer, and they haven't yet, as well as hopefully giving more details about this purported evidence that they put forward last year, like where did they find it? What condition was it in? Was it digital? Was it paper? All that sort of thing. Is why now? They have complete aerial control over Gaza. This guy is on air several times a day sometimes. If he was definitively identified as a terrorist almost a year ago, why now? Is it because he was reporting on the quote-unquote hunger narrative, which we know the Israelis are absolutely incensed by? I mean, you saw Benjamin Netanyahu's twin statements last night, one to the English-speaking media, one to the Hebrew-speaking media, where he sought to debunk the fact that there's starvation in Gaza. Was that what got him killed? We don't know.
Henry, where does this leave the broader issue of coverage in Gaza? Because one reason people like al-Sharif were so prominent and important is that foreign journalists cannot get access to Gaza. It's been closed for a long time, and there's been a lot of pressure on the Israelis to let journalists in on independent trips. We just can't do it. So what now?
Netanyahu indicated yesterday that more journalists would be allowed in. I would be absolutely amazed if that involves being allowed in to operate independently before the war is over. I would think it inevitably will mean more embedded trips, where you come in under total IDF control and you remain under IDF control the whole time, and often you have to agree before you go in that they can veto various pictures or bits of information that you might want to use. I've done that. I did that a few weeks ago. I found it quite helpful in certain ways, because there are certain things that you see and that they can't control, like the general state of the place and other things. It's better than nothing, but it's not independent reporting. I would be amazed if it was proper independent reporting. It's been such a feature of this war that non-Gazan journalists can't get anywhere near it. So I imagine we'll continue operating in the same environment, which is that the Israelis don't allow independent journalists in, and they then are very aggressively question the veracity of any information which we manage to get out of there, either by just generally saying, well, how can you trust it? Or very often by tracing back the source of that information, whether it's freelance stringer journalists, local journalists on the ground, photographers, and then looking for evidence that might suggest that they're not impartial, like a photo of them standing next to a known Hamas terrorist at some point 10, 15, 20 years ago, or use of the word martyr in their Facebook account, or resistance, or something like that. I imagine that it will continue to be very, very difficult to report objectively on Gaza without getting a lot of criticism from the people who are stopping us reporting from Gaza, if you see what I mean.
Henry Bodkin there, reporting from Jerusalem. Coming up, how Australia is managing both Donald Trump and Xi Jinping. Welcome back. Over the past few weeks, we've run a 3-part series on the rise of China's military. It's a topic that defines the world today and which we return to frequently on this podcast. But what about other countries in the region? How are they responding to the Western Pacific becoming a contested space for the first time since 1945? Well, for Australia, it means walking a fine line between a hawkish and increasingly isolationist ally in Donald Trump's America and a crucial trading partner, potentially volatile competitor, a frenemy, to use the technical term, in Xi Jinping's China. And despite all the concerns about China's ambitions, last month Australia's Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, visited China for a week-long state visit to cement economic ties with Mr. Xi. Recently, I spoke to Chris Pyne, a former Australian Defence Minister, and interestingly, both a friend and long-time political opponent of Mr. Albanese. I asked him about the relationship with China, the future of AUKUS, and why the opportunities and risks in the Pacific look very different from down under.
China decided in the last 10 years that they would challenge the United States' position in the Indo-Pacific and would no longer accept the international rules-based order, which, to be fair to China, is a Western construct post the Second World War, led by the United States, which, by the way, has, of course, made China the country it is today from an economic point of view, because it allowed China to become part of the World Trade Organization and economically bring hundreds of millions of Chinese out of poverty. But that happened in the last 10 years, since the mid-2010s, and the United States recognized this change and asked the Australians and the Australians themselves realized that we had to not be able to rely entirely on the US. So we would need to have our own sovereign capabilities and invest in our military. And one big change in the Indo-Pacific, which is missed by most people, is that China now has a blue water navy, which they've never had before. Their navy was always designed really to look around the coast of China, mainland China, South China Sea and Taiwan Straits and so on. And it wasn't designed to go out into the Pacific. But that has changed, and China now does have a blue water navy. And that gives them the capability, of course, if they chose to, which I very much doubt they would, but it does change the military dynamic of the Indo-Pacific, because it means that they can challenge the United States further afield than East Asia. And they could, if they wished to, which I don't think they would, but they could cut Australia off from the United States. And until the 2010s, our procurement was essentially designed around having the most interoperative military with the United States on the globe, which I believe Australia did achieve and continues to achieve. And we would be as close to the United States as any country in the world, if not closest. And if China was able to dominate, say, the Coral Sea in a military conflict, then that would mean that Australia would not be able to defend itself. And so the government at the time, led by first Tony Abbott and then Malcolm Turnbull, decided that we would have to create sovereign capabilities in the areas that we need them. One of those, of course, is missiles and munitions and the MROU of aircraft and submarines and shipbuilding and infantry fighting vehicles and combat reconnaissance vehicles, things that we hadn't previously needed to do. And so that is a significant change in the 2010s that caused Australia to rethink its strategic position militarily.
And the AUKUS deal, which of course comes after your time in government, fits very much into that kind of context, because it's about procuring nuclear-powered submarines that can stay at sea for longer, deeper in the Pacific, which is something you need for that new security environment. Is that a fair summary?
Definitely. The government had previously asked the United States if we could acquire nuclear-powered submarines during the Abbott period, and the Americans had said no, that they wouldn't provide us with nuclear-powered submarines, and so we would need to continue our search for a conventional submarine to replace Collins class, which is a very good class of submarine. And then that's why I went through the process. I was the minister that signed the contract for the attack class submarines with a naval group from France, and that had begun, and we were happy with that contract. But then Scott Morrison, as Prime Minister, re-asked the US in the context of a new AUKUS, a new document that brought together US, UK and Australia, so a wider plan. He again asked the US if they'd give us the technology for nuclear-powered submarines, and the Biden administration said yes. So that changed the dynamic very considerably, because as everyone knows, nuclear-powered submarines can stay at sea for much longer periods of time and are very quiet. And the key advantage that any submarine has over any other is its ability to stay below the surface and be as quiet as possible. So while it was very controversial at the time, cancelling the attack class contract, despite the fact that I had signed it and negotiated it, I thought it was the right decision. Whether they should have kept half a dozen of those and then got half a dozen nuclear-powered submarines is neither here nor there, because that decision wasn't made. But that is the reason why AUKUS first came about.
I want to ask you basically about the fate of AUKUS now, because as we know, the Pentagon has launched a review of it to see if it fits into the America First strategy. There's a lot of open questioning of whether it's actually in America's interest, whether America can supply these submarines. I mean, first of all, do you think AUKUS can survive? Are the Americans going to walk away from it? And if so, what does Australia do? The other question is, given what you said about America asking Australia to kind of stand on its own 2 feet a bit more when you were defense minister, it seems like they're kind of changing their tune, or they're saying do this and making it more difficult. What's your answer to those 2 points?
No one ever said any democracy was easy. I think Winston Churchill, your man, said democracy was the worst form of government ever invented, except for all the others. And governments change. And the Trump administration is putting even more pressure on its allies to not be protectorates, particularly in Europe, but instead be genuine partners. And I support that. I don't think that the countries in the West that rely on the United States in so many ways should exist under the umbrella of United States military protection and not do their part. And Australians do always want to do their part. So I don't really feel that the American requests on Australia are unreasonable ones, nor on the NATO countries. I think a lot of people in the media see that differently, but I don't think there should be any free rides on the US. So I do think Australia should continue to lift its spending on defence, and it is. And I'm pleased to see the changes being made in places like the UK and NATO more generally for increase in spending on defence. I don't think that countries like Canada or New Zealand, for example, in Five Eyes countries, should spend less than 1% of their GDP on defence, knowing that Australia and the United States will be there. I think everybody has to meet the challenge that China and China's friends are making to the international rules-based order.
But Chris, it sounds like from what you said, you started doing this nearly 10 years ago. You started pulling your weight. Australia started doing all these things, started doing exactly what America asked. And now it sounds like AUKUS they might just scrap that. I'm not really sure why, to be honest. I mean, what do you do with that? It sounds like Australia has been trying to do what the Americans ask, and now they're making it more difficult.
Well, I'm in the party that believes that there's no possibility that AUKUS will be scrapped. I think there's a lot of hype about AUKUS being scrapped from people who don't really know what they're talking about. I think the likelihood of AUKUS being scrapped is maybe 5%, and that would only be if the United States decided to cut off their nose to spite their face, which I don't believe they will do, because AUKUS is a very good deal for the US, the UK and Australia, and it's very, very important to the West. And I have no doubt that the advice that's given to the Trump administration will be just that. And I'll give you one example, which hardly gets any coverage in the press at all. But part of AUKUS is about a new submarine yard at Osborne. Osborne is in Adelaide, South Australia. We've got one there now, but a much more advanced and larger submarine. And so the Osborne shipyard there will be expanded and modernised to be able to make nuclear-powered submarines. So that will give the West, or the Anglophone countries, 4 significant submarine yards: Newport News, Groton, Barrow and Osborne. So it increases our capacity by 25% to do nuclear-powered submarines. That is a little known and understood fact. Secondly, the United States and Britain and Australia will have a submarine naval base in the Indian Ocean. The Collins-class submarines are largely based in the Indian Ocean now in Perth at HMAS Stirling. That yard is going to be enormously expanded, and not just be an Australian submarine yard, but it'll include the United States, 5 nuclear-powered submarines from the United States on rotation and 1 British submarine. It'll be called Submarine Rotational Force West, and it is effectively a US, UK and Australian submarine base, which the US doesn't currently have in the Indian Ocean, and it is on the same latitude as Beijing and a large part of China. And it's the only place on the globe where that would be the case. So AUKUS is not just a submarine procurement contract. Unfortunately, a lot of the press see it through a very narrow prism, but it's also about increasing the military capability of the US around the globe. A submarine yard, another submarine base, And then, of course, there's all of Pillar 2 as part of AUKUS. There's the largest technology transfer between like-minded countries and the easiest technology transfer between like-minded countries of any three countries on the globe in hypersonics and quantum computing and laser energy and space situational awareness, and the list goes on.
Just to get the thrust across, it sounds like what you're saying is that if, as many Americans and the Trump administration, people like Elbridge Colby and so on say, China is the pacing threat, that's the thing they've got to respond to. AUKUS is designed to respond to that threat, and therefore cancelling it would be basically completely mad and counter to that, and therefore you don't think that will happen?
I believe that the Trump administration's review will find that AUKUS is a critical part of their response to the challenge from China to the US in the Indo-Pacific. And to put it another way, Roland, if AUKUS was to be cancelled, it would have to be replaced by exactly the same thing.
Thank you so much. That's a very good point to make. Look, I wanted to ask you about, basically, China is the thing that's shaping this whole conversation. We wouldn't be having this conversation if it wasn't about China, although I love Australia for my own reasons. But this whole conversation is really, that's why you were spending more money getting on for 10 years ago in government. That's why we're talking about AUKUS. China is shaping the conversation in many, many ways. Your Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, has just conducted a extraordinary six-day state visit to China, which by all accounts went very, very well. The Chinese press seemed incredibly pleased. He had a personal dinner with Xi Jinping. All the mood music sounds really, really successful. Now, I know that you are old political sparring partners, and I know you've crossed swords with Anthony Albanese many times during your career. And of course, you are from you're from opposing political parties. So I'm not expecting you to endorse everything he does, but asking you to set aside your kind of party political loyalties or so on. What do you make of that visit? And I suppose what I'm trying to ask is, it seems to me that he, like perhaps any Australian Prime Minister, has to walk this kind of difficult line. And that's a line between your main security partner is the United States. China, for you as for the United States, is potentially a challenge, potentially a threat. And yet at the same time, it's a really, really crucially important trading partner. And it is beginning to dominate the economic landscape of the Indo-Pacific. And therefore, you've got to have a good relationship with them. What did you make of that visit? Was it the right thing to do? And what are your thoughts about Australia navigating that really delicate tightrope?
Well, despite the fact that Anthony and I are on different sides of the political fence, he and I were leader of the House and manager of opposition business together for 10 years. We swapped jobs and literally swapped offices, and we are, as much as you can be in politics, we admire each other from other sides of the fence, and we get along very well. We're very good friends. When you fight with somebody every day for 10 years, you get to know them very well. And Anthony is a good friend.
Oh, you're voting Labour now?
No, I'm not voting Labour now. No, definitely not. But I can admire and respect people on all sides of politics. I think Anthony's visit to China was exactly the right thing to do in the post-election period. And the relationship with China in Australia is very nuanced. But Anthony at no point departed from the largely bipartisan view in Australia, which is that we are not putting in any way our relationship with the United States at risk, either economically or militarily. But we will and do trade and welcome investment from China and with China, but understanding that we have different values in some areas and we can disagree, as friends should be able to do. And let me give you a good example. When China imposed economic sanctions, for want of a better description, or pressure points on Australia, like the extraordinarily high tariffs on wine and lobsters and other products for shorter periods of time than wine, the Australian economy grew. So if China was trying to send a message to Australia of economic pressure, it was a counterproductive measure because the ASEAN nations looked at that and wanted to see how Australia responded. And we looked for new markets. Our economy grew. And 2 years later, the Chinese realized that had been a counterproductive period and ended those economic measures. And Australia at no point changed our geopolitical view of promotion of democratic values and liberties and freedoms in order to have China change that policy that they adopted at that time. And that's what mature countries do. And I don't think China, all my dealings with China when I was in the defense portfolio and other portfolios, they respect maturity and honesty, and they want to work with other countries. It doesn't mean that they always will do what we ask them to do. Far from it. And we have to protect our interests, and they are the challenge to the US in the Indo-Pacific. And so we are doing that. But none of those things are at odds with each other. I'd also say, Roland, by the way, the percentage of trade with China has dramatically dropped in the last few years. So whereas it was approaching 50% of all of our trade before the economic measures in recent years, it's now not anywhere close to 50% of our trade.
We want to talk to you because you've been a defence minister. You've sat in the office. You've seen, the threat assessments and all the stuff that you can't talk about, right? You're someone who is very familiar with what's going on. You said in 2021, obviously after you'd left office, that Australia could be drawn into a war with China over Taiwan in the next 5 to 10 years. Is that still your assessment?
Yes, it's possible. I mean, I think it's unlikely. I think what I said, it was a speech at the Adelaide University. I said that the chance of a war over Taiwan and Australia being drawn into it was greater now than it had been in the next 5 to 10 years. And I think that is definitely the case. If you ask me, do I think there'll be a war over Taiwan? My answer is no. But countries need to prepare for the worst, and that will hopefully avoid the worst occurring. And so I do think China obviously has designs on Taiwan, that is part of their official policy. Do I think that they would use force to try and reunite Taiwan with mainland China? Although that's an arguable point whether it would be reunification since it's never been governed by the Chinese Communist Party. But do I think they will do that? I think the answer is that the cost is still too great.
It was reported in the Financial Times pretty much while Mr. Albanese was in China that the Americans have been pressuring both Australia and Japan to make much more concrete commitments, to offer up plans. What would you do if China invades Taiwan? What help are you going to give? What are your war plans? How would you have responded to that request when you were Defence Minister?
Well, the United States and Australia, and Japan for that matter, and South Korea, but particularly Australia and the US, have a very close working relationship at a military to military level. And I have no doubt that there are many confidential classified discussions about the Indo-Pacific and the threats to other countries in the Indo-Pacific on a very regular basis. As you would know, Australia, through things like Talisman Sabre, the big military maneuvers in the north with many other countries, but particularly with the United States and Japan and South Korea, etc. They do a lot of planning, but I really probably can't talk about anything beyond that.
Okay, fair enough. Because last question, I mean, it sounds like you're not a catastrophizer. Some of us, we've had generals in the UK saying we're going to be in world war, we're going to be fighting Russia. Australia doesn't really have to worry about that threat so much. But we have people over here, retired generals, saying we could be at war with Russia. We have to act as if we're going to be at war with Russia in the next 3, 4, 5 years, because that is a serious threat. It sounds like you're not quite in that space regarding China. Would you be able to just summarize very quickly your view of the level of threat of war in the Pacific at this point?
I don't think there will be a war in the Pacific. And I say so for a particular reason. Because of China's one-child policy for many decades, many of the families in mainland China have one child. And many of those families have a male child who's in the military, because most of the people in the Chinese military are men. And most of the casualties in a war in the Indo-Pacific would therefore be, from a Chinese point of view, if there was such a terrible thing, they would be males in families with one child, and that would be the end of that family line. So I think it's very unlikely that President Xi or anybody in the Chinese Communist Party would want to be the person who took that extraordinary risk and was responsible for the lives of hundreds of thousands of people. And that would create social dislocation in China. And history tells us that the only threat to the rulers of China over history has been the social dislocation of the middle class in particular. And the Chinese Communist Party has been very, very careful to ensure that the Chinese population gives them social license to be the one-party government of mainland China. And a war in the Indo-Pacific, it's easier to say that that's going to happen than actually then consider the consequences for all the countries in the Indo-Pacific. And there'd be very, very serious consequences. For the same reason, Roland, there hasn't been a nuclear war since the Second World War is because of the consequences. And it's very easy for retired air commodores and admirals and generals to move imaginary divisions around on the board. But the ministers, the prime ministers, the presidents, the premiers, whoever they might be, who have to make those decisions, they are dealing with people's lives, and they don't make those decisions easily, which is why there hasn't been a land war in the Indo-Pacific since China invaded Vietnam in 1979-80 over the summer, and that's now a very long time ago.
The former Australian Defence Minister Christopher Pyne speaking to me there from Adelaide. That's all for this week. We'll be back on Friday with our usual updates. Until then, that was Battle Lines. Goodbye. Battle Lines is an original podcast from The Telegraph created by David Knowles. If you appreciated this show, please consider following Battle Lines on your preferred podcast app. And if you have a moment, leave a review as it helps others find the show. To stay on top of all our news, subscribe to The Telegraph, sign on to our Dispatches newsletter, or listen to our sister podcast, Ukraine, for latest. You can also get in touch directly by emailing battlelines@telegraph.co.uk or contact us on X. You can find our handles in the show notes. This episode of Battle Lines was hosted by me, Roland Oliphant, and produced by Max Bauer. The executive producer is Louisa Wells.